And we are probably live. Professor Bruce Hood, it's so great to see you.
And it's great to see you, Mel.
Once in a while, I get to interview celebrities whom I actually know, and you're one of them.
Oh, shucks.
So first of all, I should welcome everybody. This is the New Books Network, and I'm Mel Rosenberg, and usually I host the channel of children's literature, but the book and the person I'm going to interview today has a much broader scope, including children, but not limited to children. And Professor Bruce Hood, the Sunday Times has called you the high priest of happiness.
That's great. Love it.
So we're going to be happy and merry and spend the next 45 minutes talking about happiness. So it makes me very happy, first of all, that your book is doing so well. We're celebrating right now the first year since it was published this week. And it's called The Science of Happiness, 7 Lessons for Living Well. This is a good time to wave your book madly around.
Okay.
I shouldn't say madly because you're a psychologist. And a few words about why you did it and a little brief introduction, and I get to ask you a zillion questions.
Well, first things first, I just want to say how delighted I am to see you, Mel, after all these years. One of the main messages of the book is about forming connections and establishing connections. And so here's a perfect example of what, this in practice. So I want to say I do lots and lots and lots of interviews, but I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to speak to you again, Mel, after all these years. And it's like nothing's changed. It's great.
It's completely mutual. Yes, yeah. You still have hair, and I still don't have.
don't
have hair. Why is that so funny? Why do these jokes make us happy?
Why do jokes make us happy? Oh, that's I mean, there's another book there, actually, and there are a lot of people who've written about that, what it is about happiness. I mean, look, we're a social animal, and some of our greatest joys and some of our greatest miseries are derived from other people. And along that way, it's all about emotion. Emotion are those feelings. It's what drives you. Now, emotions can drive you towards something, or they can drive you away in terms of fear. But it's why we do anything. It's why we get up in the morning. It's what life is all about. It's that emotional experience. Yes, achieving things is okay, and completion is okay. But without emotions, we'd be robotic. And so, everything we do, including laughter and culture, it's all about the feeling. It's all about the emotion. And I think that's an important point we often forget.
So it's more about how we feel than what we feel.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there is a distinction. I mean, technically, there's a distinction between feelings and emotions. You can have states, like you can have a depressive state, but you can also have specific feelings, like you might suddenly have a sense of joy or elation. And they fluctuate at different speeds. Some of them are dispositions. So those are sort of the emotional states. And some of them are a little bit kind of more fluctuating. But yeah, they're all geared, they all evolved, presumably, to either increase or decrease our behavior. Hence the word emotion. It comes from the Latin movere, meaning to move. So movement and emotion have the same origin.
Amazing. So interestingly, you've called your book Science of Happiness. I once wrote an article for Scientific American, and I called it The Science of Bad Breath. Are we trying to say something? Hey, guys, this isn't just a book. This is based on research.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that whenever you write about something which is so familiar, people kind of say, so what? Or they think that happiness is just something which it doesn't have any science to it. It's elusive because everyone knows. It's a word that we use in everyday language, happy, I'm happy. But we also recognize it has kind of different meanings in different contexts. I mean, we could have used more technical words like, affective emotions or affective forecast, and that wouldn't have really resonated. So I wanted a title which captured the kind of thing that we all talk about, which is this emotional goal, this chase. And so that's why I called it happiness. But the science of happiness is really because there is actually a huge body of work looking into what are the mechanisms, what's the evidence, what's evidence based, and that was really important to me because there are so many self-help books, everyone's got an opinion, because we all know what makes us happy, and so I wanted to make mine different by really focusing on what I do, which is trying to analyze and understand the mechanisms which operate in our brains and our minds. And that's why it was called The Science of Happiness. It's based out of a course that I teach at Bristol University. And that course isn't just my opinion. It's not just my kind of reflections on the field. It's actually, we do experiments and we test things and we produce data. And actually, the course is a really good vehicle for me to kind of teach students about the importance of the scientific method, about why data is so important, how to interpret it, and so on. So I think it's this wonderful combination of ration and reason with emotion, which is why it's called The Science of Happiness.
And you also have some persistent results at
Oh,
a
yeah.
10 or 15% level, which some people would say, oh, but a 10% increase in happiness, that's a sizable increase.
Oh gosh, who wouldn't want to be 10% happier or
Yeah,
healthier?
but Bruce, as somebody who was also a scientist for many years, I'm going to ask you now $64,000 question.
Yeah.
To do science, you have to be able to measure. You know, I spent decades trying to measure bad breath. It's elusive. Happiness is elusive.
Yeah.
How can you measure something like happiness?
That's a really good question. Indeed, that's one of the in the first lecture, I explained the problems of measuring mental states, subjective states, because you can't stick an electrode into the brain and record from a series of brain cells and say, oh, look, this person's happy. And even if you did get a measurable change, then it would be meaningless unless you ask the person, by the way, are you feeling happy now? So there's a distinction between the objectivity.
No, but Bruce, I'm gonna as an interviewer, I'm gonna bust in once in a while.
Okay.
You know, and interpretation.
Yeah.
You know, as you pointed out in your book and in other books that you've written, first of all, Taylor, who's been on the program, argues that we have 4 different minds. And you talked about the hypothalamus and you have books on how gullible people are, and how we're superstitious and we believe in God, whose existence cannot be proven, and we think in very funny ways. And then you want us to do a self-estimation of how happy we are.
Yeah, but hold on a second. That is actually the most relevant measure. Imagine this situation. Imagine I measured some physiological measure like blood pressure or something like that. And I said, well, according to this measure, it looks like you're happy. That would be meaningless if you turn around and say, actually, yeah, I'm feeling pretty miserable, actually. So in other words, the self-report is the most valid measure. Now, you might be right.
But Bruce, how do I know if I'm happy?
Well,
I'm Jewish. How can I, if I'm suffering, I'm happy? Come on.
Exactly. Well, look, I think that's another good point. I mean, we are the best yardstick, are we not? I mean, that's really what it is. Happiness is a constantly fluctuating state. I should have called the book The Science of Unhappiness, but it wouldn't have done so well, because it's really about becoming less unhappy is what I'm actually advocating. In other words, life is full of obstacles, it's full of problems, it's full of disappointments, failures, setbacks. It's how you recover from them is really a measure of your happiness. We've all got to face these things. And indeed, you need to be unhappy in order to experience those relative changes, which is why you're the best person to know whether you're happy or not. There's no objective measure. You know, 2 people could face exactly the same setback and respond to it entirely differently. So that's why you have to ask the person, well, how do you feel?
When we were asking order judges to measure bad breath, there was a scale like from 0 to 5, but there was also a continuous scale that was developed by people like you, where you take a pencil between I am deliriously happy and I'm terribly dejected.
Yeah.
And you mark on this line.
It's called the Likert scale. Yeah.
Yes. And is that used in happiness? Because that would be very useful. Because
it is used in happiness. They use a ladder usually. So the World Happiness Report goes out every year. I don't know if you're aware of this, but every nation submits this. I
am.
Yeah. Okay. So that's done on a 10-point scale. So
I am, because I live in Israel.
Yeah.
and with all of our terrible problems, we always score in the top 8 or 9 or 10.
Yeah. I know, isn't it amazing? I mean, there's some really interesting patterns. If we get time, we might talk about that. But they
No, we're
talk
going to
about,
talk about it. I mean, this year with the war, I don't think we'll score that high. But there's when I was reading your book, there's a lot of explanation for why people living in a society that's under siege,
yeah,
with
why they
all the
actually come together.
pain.
Mm.
Yeah, yes.
Well,
So go ahead.
that's because the biggest determinant of a happy society is one which is integrated. Societies which are very individualistic, very fractionated, where there's a lot of discrepancies between the haves and the haves not, they're the unhappiness. They're the societies which are the least happy. So at the top of the scale, every year they've done this for the past 15, 20 years or so. It's the Nordic countries. Those guys up there might be freezing their ghoulies off, but they're happy. Now, finally, I was
And yet they still have a high incidence of suicide.
you see, no, that is actually a bit of a myth. That's an
Oh.
interesting statistical anomaly.
Mm.
So I heard this as well, and I was concerned about this sort of really weird situation. But actually, it turns out it might be an artifact rather than a reality. But that's not to say, and here's an important point. That's not to say that they're wandering around deliriously smiling at each other and kind of. When I gave a talk in Portugal earlier this year, the Finnish ambassador was there, and I gave the talk and we got chatting away. And she said, I don't, we don't walk around with big smiles on our face. We're quite miserable all the time. And I've met quite a few people from Nordic countries, and it's true. You see, the thing is, when you ask them a question about happiness, what they're thinking about is more to do with a sense of contentment, a sense of things being okay. So it goes back to what I was saying. In many ways, it's unhappiness is what we're measuring. Now,
Yeah.
the
So one
reason,
second, Bruce. So is your ladder a descriptory ladder?
yeah. So it says, imagine on a scale of 0 to 10, where do you think you are relative to where you were before? So I mean, it's done a number of different ways, but it's a kind of it's a ladder scale. And so the top countries tend to be the Nordic countries, and the reason is, and I think there's a number of reasons, but it comes down to it's a fair society. They're more balanced. They've got a lot of social support, and they trust each other. They trust their authorities more than we do. We don't trust in the UK and the US. We're very suspicious, very paranoid. We don't trust our neighbors. There was a great experiment done about 5 years ago. They dropped a whole lot of wallets in 46 countries, in something like 400 different towns, and they measured how many people hand the wallets back. And it turns out the ones that hand the wallets back are all the Nordic countries. So they have a greater sense of civil responsibility and trust. And I think that speaks volumes about the cause of despondency, or the cause of unhappiness is a feeling of having no control. And this is a phenomenon that's well known in psychology. You remove people's perceptions of control, you put them in a war zone, or you do something like that. That's when people start to get stressed. And stress inevitably leads to unhappiness unless you can cope with it. So it kind of explains what you were saying earlier on about Israel, that even though it's a war torn, it's in the middle of a war, you can still have a lot of communal thoughts, communal, goals together. This is why Canada is suddenly finding its new identity. As it feels threatened, and it's becoming. And you're a Canadian, no, I'm a Canadian. Well, we're starting.
I must say that I'm much less proud to be a Canadian recently.
Oh,
I know
really?
you're proud. Yes, I know you're prouder. We're not going
Okay.
to go there because we said we weren't going to talk politics.
Okay.
And
Sure.
we're not going to talk about anti-Semitism today.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
And we won't go there. But
Okay.
let's talk about the brain.
Okay. The brain.
You're
Yeah.
you're a neuroscientist.
I trained as a neuroscientist. I'm a developmental psychologist primarily, which means I study children. My research, my training was actually in low-level eye movement systems. So I was kind of, I wasn't cutting up brains, but I was kind of doing stuff effectively the same. I was using a lot of electrophysiology to measure brain activation during different states. But then over the years, I've been doing this a long time, 4 decades. I've been moving higher and higher up the nervous system. So I started off with the low level stuff, and now I'm dealing with God and belief and trust and happiness. So I kind of find these more, highfalutin ideas much more interesting. But yeah, the brain is the origin of the mind, in my opinion. And I feel that we can understand more about the human condition when we understand how the brain works, and moreover, how we understand that as a developmental process. So in the book, I talk about the fact that we're born as egocentric little kids. In other words, children don't really have a concept of an external world over and beyond their immediate responses. And also, they're the center of attention for many parents. So their kind of view or their worldview is very egocentric, which is self focused. Over time, they have to become socialized. They have to learn how to cooperate and to communicate and to get on with other kids in order to be accepted, because
I,
that's the priority.
I did a lot of self-flagellation when I was reading your book, uh, be, because I was such a miserable kid. You know, my great uncle would send me $100, and I'd say, "Hi, Uncle Ruben. I got 95 in history and 93 in geography and 92." Not one sentence in, "How are you guys doing in Chicago? How's the weather?" And this really struck me to the quick, you know, as to
Mm,
how self-centered kids can be.
they are, they are, and most of us grow out of that. Not everyone. Some people remain very self-centered and very narcissistic. And I believe that, one of the problems with social media, if we get time to go into that, is it enhances or it actually amplifies, paradoxically, I call it anti-social media, because it makes people more self-focused rather than other-focused, which doesn't seem to fit with what we're told about social media. But because of the way it is organized and engineered, it actually turns your attention inwardly upon yourself. And so I think that is a big mistake because, first of all, if you're living inside your own head, it can be a pretty miserable place because you're blowing all your problems out of proportion. You're not getting any perspective. If, on the other hand, you reach out and start connecting with other people, that means your problems seem to be less paramount. So you get a better viewpoint, you get a better perspective. But you also begin to realize that other people have problems in their lives as well. And you can benefit from the social support, the shared responsibilities. This is going back to what we were saying about community. So I think that really the secret to happiness is, well, a number of things, is to recognize that we are biased, to pay attention to things when they're going wrong, to realize that actually a lot of our problems will eventually go away and not get so set up by them, but just to form those connections, because I think that's what the secret to happiness is all about. It's getting the balance between self and others right.
You have a graph, actually like a connectivity thing in
Yeah.
your book, and there's somebody named Mel there, and I was happy for a moment that you remembered me, but then I was sad because I only had one connection.
Yeah.
Bruce, I want to talk about the children more because
Yeah.
ostensibly children's literature and so on, and I want to talk about young Bruce
Oh, yeah.
because I have a theory, it's not mine, that we end up doing things that are related to our childhood if we have issues with our childhood. And both of us
Mm.
have issues with our childhood.
Everyone has issues. Anyone who says they don't have issues, I don't think is being authentic and honest.
But, but,
It is,
but those of us who deal with children, you
yeah,
were a child psychological researcher.
yeah,
I write children's books. I know that I'm stuck at the age of 5. That's how I feel.
yeah. Well, my family think I'm fairly egocentric, which they think is ironic because they said, "Well, you're kind of a bit of a narcissist. You seem to be very self-centered." I'm also highly self-critical of myself. I mean, I will say this, physician, heal thyself. I mean, I kind of know what I'm doing wrong, so I'm always constantly in a constant battle to self-improve, to try and be less egocentric, to try and be more, to try and listen more. I tend to dominate, and that's just because of a feeling of insecurity. I mean, I often feel like, and most people in academia feel like imposters because they often are aware of their inadequacies. Whereas people who seem to be less, in that field will probably not feel such an imposter. But it's very
Well,
common for people who are successful to feel like imposters.
neither of us did the cancer research.
No.
If you're doing cancer research, you don't feel like an imposter. If you're studying bad breath or happiness, but what I would argue is that people like us are drawn to these subjects. Um,
Okay.
I don't think that. I mean, I know you a little bit. I know about a little bit about your life. We've had some wonderful conversations. You had difficulties as a kid.
Oh, sure. Yeah. My father was an abusive alcoholic, and I had a terrible time growing up. It was really quite traumatizing in many ways. It wasn't. He died when I was 15, and frankly, I was happy to see the back of him, and that's a terrible thing to say. But I felt my life had been so dominated and ruined by him. Now, of course, I can kind of understand he was actually a flawed character. He was in, he was in the post-war. He fought in Malaya, and he had PTSD. He'd been traumatized by war. And that's where the alcohol and the abuse came in. And so I didn't know that at the time, because when you're young, you don't understand these adult things. But from my perspective, I just thought it was terrible. And now I see it in retrospect. I realize what was going on.
Can you forgive him?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think anyone is essentially evil. Even though there's a few people I'd like to kind of label like that, but I think that we are a product, partly of our genes, but also with those environments, and those environments can produce monsters. But that's not because there's some intrinsic thing that made them become like that. There's certain individuals who reach the highest seats of power who shall remain nameless, but we know that they probably had a pretty awful childhood.
Okay, so, but I'm going to be egocentric and say that from my point of view, the reason I write for 5-year-olds is probably because I'm on some search, for the little Melvin in Ottawa.
Yeah.
Trying to, correct whatever happened 67 years ago or whatever.
Possibly. Yeah.
Do you ever feel that you are best suited for this because you're climbing out of the unhappiness? I don't know if I explain myself properly.
I get that. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. And I will say that I am actually dispositionally quite optimistic. All right. So even though I had a really kind of crappy childhood, I've always been entrepreneurial. I've always thought things can get better. I get out, when I'm knocked back, and you get knocked back a lot the way that I live my life. I mean, I put myself up for a lot of failure. I mean, I throw myself into things where I really shouldn't be doing it. I'm much more reckless. But having said that, I can recover much more quickly than many people. So I think that my strength, as it were, is not ability; it's refusal to give up. It's tenaciousness, and that I think is what I'm probably. I think people would agree with me on that. That is true. That I generally will put up with setbacks. As a writer, believe me, it goes with. Having said that,
you're telling me.
Yeah, that 1-star review on Amazon. I'll focus on that. I'll forget all the other 5 stars. It's that one bloody review and 1-star review will just completely floor me. But I'll get over it. I mean, I'll curse and swear, but yeah.
It also goes to what you were talking about, because it makes you, first of all, a more empathic person. And secondly, when you look at that scale, right, and I also know from things that happened to me, what it is to be very low on that happiness scale.
Yeah.
Rock bottom, deep in a well.
Yeah.
And then you have your tethering, you have, okay, you write about this in your book. You have the tether, you're able to compare yourself the way you are now to a very, very sad Bruce Hood.
So this is I just came off another interview, by the way, Mel, today, and there was a bunch of these are a bunch of students up in a university, and they were doing a course on science journalism, and they wanted to interview me, and I graciously said, sure, of course, I'm very happy to, and they were very surprised, and they wanted to know what's the number one piece of advice. And I said, stop comparing yourself to other people, compare yourself to yourself, because you are the best metric, you're the best yardstick. There's no point comparing yourself to other people, because first of all, you're gonna get it wrong, because you can't see everyone's full profile. All you see are the successes, and wherever you look, there's always going to be someone doing better than you. So stop just doing that. All right. And that's the problem with social media. I think it amplifies the discrepancies. It presents an unrealistic view of how other people are doing. And so everyone's going to feel inadequate. So that's kind of my one recommendation is look at yourself and keep a diary. By the way, if anyone's watching and listening to this and they want a kind of tangible piece of advice, what I would suggest is start keeping a journal. Start keeping a diary. Start writing things down. And the reason that's such a good idea is, first of all, it allows you to process things much more deeply. If you're trying to deal with it in your head, you're going to get it wrong. You're going to blow everything out of proportion. When you start to write it down and document it, It processes it, and it seems to be less impactful on you once you've got it down on paper. But the other really good thing about it is that a year later, you can review your diaries or your journals, and you can see, oh my God, that thing which had me so upset, well, I don't care about it anymore. So it gives you tangible evidence that life moves on and that you can get better. So I think these are the things I recommend, which is trying to become more objective about your subjective state. Because if you just trust your own mind, you're unfortunately going to end up with a distorted view of the world.
One of the things that bothers me about this whole thing
Mm.
is I like to play Scrabble.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I play Scrabble against the computer. He's very quick, or she, or it. And like sometimes, you have these 7 letters and you're sure that they can form some word, and it could be a crossword puzzle or a chess move or whatever, or understanding some magic. And you have a real sense of something, but then the moment that you find the word or solve the riddle or understand the magic is gone.
Yes and no. So for magic, yes, I agree. When you understand the mechanism, then it's very disappointing, which is why I do a bit of magic. I never reveal how I do it. I have done so in the past, and you can tangibly see the faces drop, like, oh, that's not that clever. But I will say there's a there is one situation where it was called the orgasm of understanding. And it's really that moment in science when you suddenly have an insight and it all falls into place. And that's when the pieces all start to fit together. I've had that a few times. It's a really delightful, joyful experience, which is happiness, yeah. But it's more about it's a sense of completion. And I think this explains a lot of people's motivations. People who collect things, they're motivated for a sense of completion. They're chasing a kind of end
So
state.
I want to ask you about this, Bruce,
Mm.
because you are an expert in looking for old underneath the ground.
Yes, mail detecting. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, yeah. I used to do it as a kid. I did it in the teenage when I was a teenager.
You still do it, Bruce.
I took it up again. I took it up again about at the pandemic. I think my wife was getting so fed up with me in the house. She said, go out detecting again. So I bought a detector and I've become obsessed with it again. And I live in a part of the world. I live in Somerset, which is in the west side of England, where I'm near Bath, which is a
Yeah.
famous Roman spa town. And all around, and I live in the countryside, all around me are fields, and I'm surrounded by history. And I've dug up, oh, I was out yesterday, actually. I was out yesterday with a very, very wealthy guy. We're talking half a billionaire type levels. And he's bought all this land up near Cirencester, another Roman part. And yet, despite all his wealth, he loves going out with me and we like digging up holes and finding old stuff. So there's something intrinsically really rewarding about finding a coin that's 2,000 years old and just wondering who dropped it, who had it. And it connects you. All those eons of time just evaporate in that moment when you suddenly realize, gosh, I've been here for what, how long is my life and how long is civilization gone? And by the way, there used to be the Romans and the Vikings and the Saxons and the Normans and yada, yada. And so we start to get a bigger perspective. And I think that's one of the messages I end the book on, talking about how to get perspective is to sort of see yourself, is to regard the preciousness of life, to regard yourself as just one small piece of a much larger picture, but not diminish your sense of identity. I think that's important. But you can lose yourself. And I think losing yourself to the bigger picture, and I'm sure this is what religion does for many people, it's part of that sense of belonging. I talk about it was Carl Sagan who was the great science communicator. He talks about I didn't talk about in the book, but I have subsequently referred to Carl Sagan in many ways because he wrote this wonderful passage called The Pale Blue Dot. I don't know if you know this, Mel. Have you ever heard of it? Yeah. It's
I've
this.
probably heard of it, but the brain.
Okay, so I'll paraphrase it because I can't remember it verbatim, but basically it's a picture of Voyagers. It's leaving our galaxy, okay? And so you can see the picture of Earth. It's set against this darkness and it's captured in a beam of sunlight. And he describes it saying, look, there's a pale blue dot. This is our home. Every tyrant, every master of the universe, every person existed on that pale blue dot. And what he's doing in that phrase, in that passage, he's really just pointing out scale. He's pointing out, relative perspective, which I think is really important because when you become so egocentric, you become dismissive of other people. You kind of have a sense of privilege. You have a sense of entitlement and a sense of kind of overimportance, which I think is inevitably going to end in downfall. So I think it's really important to try and reestablish our humanity, reestablish our sense of purpose and perspective with other people. So I think staring at, this is one of the things I recommend is that at night, if you've got really good skies, we don't have them here that often in England, but when the clouds are cleared and you look up and you can see, all the stars in the night, it is overwhelming. And I think it's a wonderful kind of reminder because
sorry.
I was just going to say, well, look, I think the problem is, and I say this to my students, you guys live your life on autopilot. In other words, you're kind of going around staring at your phone, staring at your social media. You're not actually engaging in the world around you or engaging with each other in appropriate ways very often. And you're missing out on all those simple little wonders, all those simple little things. And that's why when you're kind of on autopilot, you're looking inwardly. You're not really connecting with other people. And I say, stop the autopilot, just try and become more mindful. That's a word that's become very popular. But yeah, it's true. Become more mindful of others around you.
You reminded me of one of the most moving experiences with Jeff Pulver, whom you know. We would hire a bus and go down to the Negev, to the Ramon crater, where it is really pitch dark. And you go down with a group of people.
Yeah.
And you put blankets down under the sky. And you watch as millions and millions of stars appear.
Yeah.
And it's not something that you can transfer by talk. You can't look at the pictures and be moved. You have to be there with this magnitude. So, Bruce, I concur. But there's two. I'm going to segue now to two things that I don't know which one to ask you first.
Okay.
Let's start with growing old. There's research, and you allude to it, that people who grow old are happier, and that doesn't make sense. But yeah, I'm growing older, and most of the day I'm happier.
Yeah,
and it doesn't make sense to me either. What's the matter with you?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. First of all, I think we strive less. As we sort of become more comfortable in our old age and our skin, we're not kind of constantly comparing ourselves and hoping for something better. When you're young, every possibility presents itself, and you're worried about making the right choices. So there's a real feeling that of worry and concern that you're not making. And this is why I see in my students who I teach all the time. They're anxious about the amount of choices they have. In many ways, this is a paradox because people assume that the more choices you have, the happier you will be. Actually, it works the other way around. If you're presented with too many choices, you become overwhelmed. And that's one of the dangers of youth. I think the other thing, of course, is that when you're young, of course, there are many things which are unpredictable. And so with age, you get experience and wisdom, and you start to prioritize those things, and you become more familiar with the patterns. So you get wise. And that's something that is very difficult. You can't teach that to children. They almost have to discover them by themselves. But it's a feeling of not having a lot of control. And again, when you get to our age, we're generally financially secure. We're if we're in a relationship which is fairly stable, it's not like we're going to be Tindering around to find other people. It's all kind of I don't know what you, but it's like you just kind of. It's not like
not we're giving.
Well, look, it's not like we've given up the fight. It's not like it's just becoming more comfortable, and also we're aware of our mortality. I think that's the other thing. You start to realize, actually,
being aware of your mortality makes you happy.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, well, I don't want it to happen just yet, but I do. I'd rather, but I think it does start to get you to kind of focus a little bit more on what you have. When I was younger, I thought I could have anything, and I was kind of crazily chasing every opportunity. And I think I've slowed down a bit, and slowing down, I certainly feel a little bit more balanced. Maybe that's the word I'm trying to find. It's a balance that I think age gives you. And certainly, as my body's getting older, I'm starting to creak, and things are falling off. That's not great. Having said all this, I will just say there's one caveat. I think that at the far end of life, there's some things to really be concerned about. Obviously, illness and infirmity and all those sorts of things. But one of the biggest problems we face in our society, in Western society, is the loss of the family support system. So loneliness, I think, is this epidemic, which is terrible. And I think that's a consequence of modernity and the way things have changed very rapidly for independent living. And I think that's something that we should try and work against, because there's nothing worse than ostracizing or isolating somebody. That's really bad.
This supports your premise.
Yeah, exactly.
And Bruce, this has been wonderful. And now I'm going to come to the big question.
Okay.
Which is the God question.
The God question.
Yeah, the God question.
Okay.
And this is, here in Israel, we have young people that sometimes become ultra-Orthodox out of nowhere.
Yep.
There's secular, and then, they go away for this weekend, and then they go away for 2 weekends. And the next thing you know, they're like, I want to say, for me, bonkers.
Okay.
People believe in God, and that's fine. They go to synagogue and whatever. But for me, and I want you to be critical now, this is kind of like having a lobotomy. And okay. One more sentence.
Okay.
I have this argument with my family, and now I'm having it with Mr. Professor Happiness.
Okay.
You can be happy. What? You could be. I know you want to come at me, Bruce. One second. You could be happy, believing in God, even though there's no evidence that such exists. Probably lots of evidence that doesn't. You can take a mushrooms, pill, whatever. You can have part of your frontal cortex removed, and you can be very happy.
Okay.
And people in my family say, "Yeah, there's nothing wrong with with becoming ultra-Orthodox or whatever, it makes you happy." And I say, no, because you're missing out on the meaning of life, which is your own personal struggle, your own overcoming, not God. I'm in God's hands.
Well,
help me, Bruce.
All right, okay. So
there's a movie like that.
I have to, in full disclosure here, I am not religious. I've been pretty much secular all of my life, although I did want to believe in the supernatural. And that's why I started to believe all that stuff. At the time, we had Uri Geller, another Israeli, I believe, who was kind of conning everyone.
I know him.
You should get him on your show. And so at the time, seeing is believing. And I thought, my goodness, there's all this untapped ability of the mind. That's why I wanted to go and study it. And then I discovered, actually, all this stuff is just hokum. There's no evidence for it. And that said, even though I don't believe, I do fully understand why people get so much out of religion, because it provides a sense of identity, which for many people is absolutely the most important thing, to be connected. And the thing about religion is it almost needs to be done entirely on faith. Okay, so there has to be no evidence, because otherwise it wouldn't be faith. So that's why it's totally anti-science, because that's it's by its nature it has to be. So I think that this sudden transition towards this must often reflect, I would argue, a deep yearning, a deep sense of something missing in someone's lives when they feel that they make that kind of conversion. And I certainly have known people who are both scientists and religious, and they don't see it as being a kind of contradiction. It is a contradiction, but for them, they can compartmentalize their lives and say,
Jill Bolte Taylor wouldn't say it's a contradiction, because brain, Bruce, I'm like that.
Yeah.
I say I'm not religious. I keep some, traditions.
Yeah.
I went to a religious, but hold on a second. But my brain number 3, according to Jill Bolte Taylor, my pre-kindergarten, non-verbal, happy hypothalamus on the left side brain, or maybe the right side, I can't remember, is happy-go-lucky. And across from him is my kosher brain, the number 2, other hypothalamus, linked brain, which does believe in God and believes in eternal punishment and damnation and what have you. So we can have, I'm religious when I'm on an airplane.
When you hit turbulence, yeah, exactly.
No, I'm an ex agoraphobic.
Oh, really? Okay.
I believe in God when I'm on even a smooth flight.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, look, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure about the different brains, but certainly, I mean, I wrote a book called The Self Illusion, and it was basically the same idea.
Yes.
Yeah, like there is no self. The self is a multitude of different kind of narrative stories. Those narratives are in many ways shaped by the experiences that we have. And so, yeah, you can have a narrative about who you are that was formed largely as a child that never really entirely goes away and reemerges at various points. And I think that's entirely true. I really do think the brain doesn't really ever throw away any previous version of itself. It just keeps this as sort of information that it can reassemble when it needs to, which is why suddenly people become very superstitious under right circumstances. If they're under threat, they become superstitious again. So that's a well-known phenomenon. But I think that the issue of God, um, first of all, you can't disprove it. But then, as scientists, we know you can't prove a negative. But of course, there's never an answer to the big kind of fundamental questions like, how do you have consciousness out of a brain? How can you have, how can you have that? And we don't have
Bruce,
the answers.
we have only a few more minutes, so I'm gonna have
Okay.
to be specific here.
Okay.
Okay. So if it's about being happy,
Okay.
if all life is about is being happy,
Yep.
then have that lobotomy, take those happy pills, become ultra orthodox,
Yep.
and be happy.
True.
Or not.
Well, I mean, if you were lobotomized, you take away all your motivational systems, you'd probably have no memory, so you wouldn't be able to kind of form expectations. Yeah, but you being, it's not a state I think anyone would voluntarily induce, although you probably think they are.
I'm being a little facetious here, but like the ultra orthodox, everything is in God's hands. When everything is in God's hands,
Yeah.
right, it's easier to be happy because you don't have the angst.
Yeah, you don't have any worry, so you don't have any control
of human existence.
Yeah, well, you've handed over, you surrendered control, haven't you? I mean, if you think about unhappiness is when you don't feel you have control, but if you surrender everything over to another person, then yeah, you don't need to feel any anxiety. But then, yeah, that's not the way. That's not a life I'd like to have.
Exactly. So, in concluding, and I want to thank you because I just love talking to you. And I hope our audience enjoyed this.
I hope they did as well. Leave comments below, for heaven's sake.
Yes, no, Bruce, you're brilliant, and I enjoyed your book so much. And the great thing about it is it's research-based.
Yeah.
At the end of every chapter, you have advice,
practical tips,
and some of it I didn't know, and I'm 73, and we've spoken
73
times.
You're looking good.
I'm feeling good. And practical tips. And some of them I say, oh my goodness, I wish I had known that a long time ago. And highly recommended book. And I'm not sure that after a whole book on happiness, there's happiness and then there's being content with having a meaningful existence.
Yeah, content. Yeah. So I think when I'm asked what is happiness, I think I summarize it by I'm okay, it's okay, and it'll be okay. That's what it is. The other stuff is all fluctuating and it goes up and down as it should, but it's that kind of sense of relative position.
Professor Bruce Hood, you certainly have made me happy. We're going to thank our audience.
Thank you.
And I'm going to say I've been speaking with Professor Bruce Hood on his new book, one-year-old book, baby book, Wave It Around, The Science of Happiness, 7 Lessons for Living Well, published by the estimable Simon & Schuster. And it's in airports and stores all across Britain and I don't know if UK, what the right word is, in many countries. And it really is a great book. And I'm so honored that NBN let me interview you about it. And we're going to say, my name is Mel Rosenberg, and I've been here hosting for the NBN New Books Network. Bruce, we're going to say goodbye to everybody else. Everybody else, go find your connections. Love people. Bruce, a few quick, phone somebody you love tonight.
Reconnect with somebody you haven't spoke to. Yeah, just do it. Just do it. They'll love
And
it more than you imagine.
this is what we've done now.
Yeah.
We're gonna say goodbye to everybody. We're gonna leave and come back, and everybody have a very happy day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Bruce.